There exists an ancient image, older than psychology itself, that captures something essential about certain souls who move through the world. Picture the lone wolf on the ridge at twilight, neither fleeing the pack nor seeking to dominate it, simply existing in a space of chosen solitude. This creature possesses something the Greeks called autarkeia, self-sufficiency, not born of arrogance but of profound internal completeness. When Carl Jung mapped the hidden territories of the psyche, he spoke of individuals who had integrated what he called the shadow, those darker, unacknowledged parts of the self that most people project outward or deny entirely. These integrated souls, Jung suggested, possessed a quiet authority that needed no validation, no stage, no audience. They had done the work in the cave, alone, and emerged with something the world rarely sees: strength that whispers rather than shouts. What if the rarest expression of the INFJ personality, that already uncommon type representing perhaps 1% of the population, embodies this even rarer archetype? What if beneath the familiar descriptions of the empathetic idealist lies something older, something that resonates with the lone philosopher, the hermit sage, the wanderer who walks between worlds? The Sigma INFJ represents not simply a personality type, but an identity forged in the space between belonging and isolation, power and humility, visibility and shadow. They are the ones who learned early that the world's definitions would never quite fit, and so they stopped trying to fit them. The first sign emerges in how they hold their power. Most people signal strength through volume, through presence that demands attention, through the accumulation of followers or status markers that prove their worth. The Sigma INFJ does not exhibit any of this behavior. Their strength resembles the mountain more than the storm, present and immovable but never announcing itself. They walk into rooms and something shifts, not because they seek that shift but because they carry an integrated wholeness that others unconsciously recognize. Jung wrote extensively about what he termed psychic energy, suggesting that those who have done the difficult work of individuation, of becoming truly themselves rather than merely performing social roles, emit a kind of invisible authority. The Sigma INFJ has done this work, often without realizing they were doing it, often because circumstances gave them no choice. Perhaps they grew up as outsiders, never quite fitting in with the groups that formed around them. Perhaps they experienced early losses or disappointments that forced them inward, into the cave of self-examination, before their peers even knew such caves existed. What they discovered there, in that darkness, was not weakness but foundation. They learned that validation from others, while pleasant, was not necessary. They learned that their own judgment, their own moral compass, their own sense of meaning could sustain them even when the external world offered nothing. This is not the brittle independence of the narcissist who needs to dominate others to feel powerful, nor the reactive defiance of the rebel who defines themselves against authority. This is something quieter and more complete, a self-possession that needs no audience because it was forged in private. When they speak, their words carry weight not through rhetorical flourish, but through the sense that these words have emerged from deep reflection, from someone who has looked clearly at themselves and the world, and arrived at conclusions that can withstand scrutiny. They rarely raise their voices because they do not need to, and in a world that increasingly mistakes volume for authority, their quietness becomes revolutionary. The second sign appears in their relationship with solitude. For most people, being alone represents a state to be endured or escaped, a temporary absence of the connection and stimulation that makes life meaningful. The Sigma INFJ experiences solitude differently, not as absence but as presence, not as loneliness but as necessary oxygen. The ancient philosophers understood this distinction, Aristotle noting that a person who could be happy alone was either a beast or a god, something less than human or more than human. The Sigma INFJ occupies that paradoxical space, deeply human in their capacity for connection yet godlike in their ability to thrive without it. They withdraw not from misanthropy but from necessity, recognizing that their inner world requires vast stretches of uninterrupted time to process, to create, to exist without performance. Jung called this the process of active imagination, the deliberate engagement with the psyche's depths that cannot happen in the presence of others because it requires a kind of attention impossible to maintain while navigating social dynamics. The Sigma INFJ has made this practice instinctive, retreating into solitude the way others retreat into conversation, finding there not emptiness but richness. They emerge from these periods not depleted but replenished, carrying insights that only solitude can provide. This pattern often begins in childhood, where they might have been labeled shy or antisocial by adults who could not distinguish between social anxiety and conscious preference. They learned early that birthday parties exhausted them, that crowded playgrounds felt like assaults on their nervous systems, and that their most profound experiences happened in the spaces between social obligations. As they matured, they stopped apologizing for this, stopped forcing themselves into situations that drained them to appear normal. They built lives that honored their need for solitude, choosing careers that allowed autonomy, relationships that respected their boundaries, and living spaces that provided sanctuary. Where the typical INFJ might feel guilty about this need, might push themselves to be more social to avoid disappointing others, the Sigma INFJ has integrated it fully, understanding that their solitude serves not just themselves but everyone they encounter, because only in solitude can they recharge the profound empathy and insight they offer when they do engage. They are the friend who might disappear for weeks then return with exactly the conversation you needed, the colleague who works independently but produces results that reshape projects, the partner who needs space but offers the presence of a quality that compensates for any absence. The third sign manifests in their indifference to hierarchy. The social world operates largely through vertical structures, including both explicit and implicit pecking orders, that determine who speaks first, whose opinions matter, who receives deference, and who must show it. Most people navigate these hierarchies unconsciously, positioning themselves carefully, reading the room to determine where they stand in the invisible rankings that govern group dynamics. The Sigma INFJ sees these structures clearly but refuses to participate in them, not through rebellion but through a kind of benign disregard that treats janitors and executives with the same quality of attention and respect. This is not the false egalitarianism of someone performing humility for social credit. It is genuine indifference to the markers others use to establish worth. They might sit in a meeting and ignore the senior partner's pompous speech while genuinely being interested in the intern's hesitant observation, not to make a point, but because the intern said something true, while the partner said something rehearsed. This pattern creates peculiar social dynamics because it violates the unspoken rules that hold groups together. Yet, the Sigma INFJ does it without aggression or judgment, simply operating from a different value system entirely. Nietzsche wrote about what he called master morality versus slave morality, suggesting that some individuals determine good and bad based on their own values. In contrast, others adopt the values imposed by power structures. The Sigma INFJ embodies a form of master morality in Nietzsche's sense, not through domination but through sovereignty, through the quiet insistence on judging people and situations based on internal rather than external criteria. They respect competence, authenticity, kindness, and depth regardless of where these qualities appear on the social ladder. They feel no compulsion to impress those above them or dismiss those below them because they do not acknowledge the ladder itself as legitimate. This creates both admiration and discomfort in others, admiration from those who wish they had such freedom, discomfort from those invested in maintaining hierarchies. The Sigma INFJ typically notices neither response because they are not performing this indifference for effect. They simply cannot bring themselves to care about status games when there are more interesting things to think about. They might work in corporate environments and never play the political games that others consider essential, advancing or not advancing based purely on the quality of their work, unbothered either way because their sense of worth comes from internal rather than external sources. They might move through academic settings, ignoring the prestige markers that obsess their peers, caring about ideas rather than credentials, about truth rather than reputation. The fourth sign reveals itself in their relationship with suffering. Every human experiences pain, loss, disappointment, and struggle, but people respond to suffering in dramatically different ways. Some become bitter, armored against further hurt, building walls that keep out not just pain but also joy and connection. Others become broken, unable to recover, defining themselves permanently through their wounds. The Sigma INFJ does something different, something the alchemists called solve a coagula, meaning to dissolve and coagulate, the process of breaking down base material and reforming it into something refined. They take their suffering into the cave, and they work with it, not through the therapeutic language of healing that dominates contemporary discourse, but through a more ancient process of integration that Jung mapped in his studies of transformation. They do not try to get over their pain or move past it. They move through it and with it, allowing it to reshape them, to deepen them, to burn away the unnecessary parts of personality that suffering reveals as superfluous. This is the process Jung associated with the wounded healer archetype, the recognition that only those who have descended into their own darkness can guide others through theirs. The Sigma INFJ often has a history marked by significant losses or disappointments, early betrayals or abandonments, periods of isolation or misunderstanding that would have justified bitterness or withdrawal. Instead, they used these experiences as raw material for psychological development, asking not, "Why did this happen to me?" but, "What does this reveal about existence, about human nature, about the structure of meaning itself?" They emerged from suffering not hardened but somehow more permeable, more capable of holding paradox and complexity, more able to sit with others in pain without needing to fix it or flee from it. When they encounter others who are suffering, they do not offer platitudes or toxic positivity. They offer presence, the sense that they have been in the darkness and know its geography, that suffering is not something to be ashamed of but something to be witnessed and respected. This capacity makes them natural counselors, even when they hold no formal role as such, because people unconsciously recognize that the Sigma INFJ can hold space for difficult truths. They can listen to someone's despair without trying to talk them out of it, acknowledge that sometimes life is genuinely hard and unfair, and still somehow convey that meaning remains possible. This is not optimism, but something harder won and more durable, a kind of existential resilience that does not deny suffering but refuses to let suffering have the final word. The fifth sign appears in their penetrating perception. The typical INFJ is known for insight, for the ability to read between the lines and perceive the unspoken dynamics in any situation. Still, the Sigma INFJ takes this further, possessing a vision that sometimes unsettles even those they care about the most. They see not just what people present but what people hide, not through judgment but through a clarity that comes from having looked honestly at their own shadows. Jung suggested that we can only perceive in others what we have acknowledged in ourselves, that the depth of our external perception directly correlates to the depth of our self-knowledge. The Sigma INFJ has done the uncomfortable work of cataloging their own capacity for selfishness, cruelty, weakness, and deception, not to indulge these capacities, but to understand them. This understanding gives them a kind of X-ray vision into human motivation that can be both a gift and a burden. They meet someone at a party and, within minutes, understand not just the persona being presented but the fears and desires animating that persona, the childhood wounds still seeking resolution, and the contradictions the person has not yet noticed in themselves. They sit in meetings and see not just the stated agenda, but also the hidden power struggles, the unacknowledged alliances, and the actual rather than official decision-making structure. This perception could easily become cynical, leading to the bitter superiority of the misanthrope who sees human weakness everywhere and takes satisfaction in that view. Still, the Sigma INFJ combines penetrating vision with radical compassion. They see the weakness and they understand it, recognize it as human rather than condemnable, feel sadness rather than contempt. This combination makes them safe to be vulnerable around because people sense that the Sigma INFJ will not use what they see as a weapon or leverage. Instead, they will hold it with the same acceptance they have learned to hold their own imperfections. Yet this gift also isolates them because they cannot unsee what they see, cannot participate in the comfortable fictions that make social life easier. They sit in conversations where everyone is pretending, and they feel the weight of being the only person who sees the pretense, not from superiority but from an inability to look away from the truth. They hear someone tell a story and perceive not just the story itself, but also what the story is avoiding, what the storyteller needs the audience to believe, and what reality is being edited to maintain a particular self-image. This constant perception exhausts them, satisfying their need for solitude where they can rest from the relentless input of human complexity. However, it also gives their interactions unusual depth, as when they engage with what is actually present rather than what is being performed. The sixth sign manifests in their creative relationship with convention. Every society establishes norms, or unspoken rules, about how to dress, speak, pursue relationships, build careers, and structure one's life. Most people follow these norms with minimal conscious thought, accepting them as natural rather than constructed, as inevitable rather than chosen. The Sigma INFJ sees convention clearly as construction, recognizes that the way things are done is not the same as the way things must be done, and this recognition frees them to build lives that follow internal rather than external logic. They are not rebels in the performative sense, not seeking to shock or provoke, nor defining themselves against society. However, they are fundamentally unconventional because they operate from first principles rather than inherited assumptions. They might choose careers that baffle their families, not out of irresponsibility, but because they have a clear sense that the conventional path would slowly erode something essential within them. They might structure relationships in ways that violate social scripts, might choose long-term partnerships that never involve marriage, or deep friendships that feel more primary than romantic relationships, or periods of chosen celibacy that prioritize other forms of growth. They might live in ways that seem eccentric, might travel perpetually or stay in one place for decades, might accumulate vast libraries or own almost nothing. The specific choices matter less than the fact that these choices emerged from genuine self-knowledge rather than social pressure. This unconventionality rarely feels radical to them because they are not trying to make statements. They are simply building lives that align with their actual values and temperaments rather than with external expectations. The philosopher Søren Kierkegaard wrote about what he called the night of faith. This individual achieves authentic existence by embracing the anxiety of freedom and choosing themselves over conforming to what others expect. The Sigma INFJ embodies this movement, often without knowing Kierkegaard's language for it, simply because they cannot sustain the psychological dishonesty required to live conventionally when convention conflicts with truth. They might work conventional jobs while maintaining unconventional inner lives, might appear normal on the surface while privately pursuing obsessions and questions that their peers would find strange. They create private philosophies, systems of meaning built from their reading, reflection, and experience, and they live by these philosophies regardless of whether anyone else understands or approves. This makes them difficult to categorize, difficult to predict, because they are not following the scripts that make others legible, and this illegibility is itself a form of freedom. The seventh sign appears in their relationship with power and influence. Most people pursue influence consciously, building platforms, cultivating followers, and seeking positions that allow them to shape events and opinions. Even those who claim to eschew power often pursue it through different means, wielding moral authority or intellectual superiority as tools of influence. The Sigma INFJ genuinely does not seek power in any conventional sense, not from false humility but from authentic disinterest in the mechanisms of influence as they are traditionally understood. They have no desire to lead movements, manage teams, accumulate followers on social media, or build personal brands. Yet paradoxically, they often exert a profound influence precisely because they do not seek it, as their indifference to status and validation lends their words and actions unusual weight. When someone who never promotes themselves suddenly speaks, people listen differently than they listen to the constant self-promoter. When someone who asks nothing in return offers insight or assistance, that generosity registers more deeply than performative altruism. The Sigma INFJ influences through what might be called a gravitational pull rather than magnetic attraction, not drawing people through charisma or salesmanship, but simply by being so genuinely themselves that others feel permission to explore their own authenticity. They model a way of being that does not require constant performance or validation, and people who encounter this model often find it quietly revolutionary. A single conversation with a Sigma INFJ might alter someone's life trajectory, not through advice or instruction but through the example of someone who has claimed the authority to define their own existence. This influence operates subtly, often invisibly. The Sigma INFJ is rarely aware of the ripples they create because they are not tracking impact or measuring success. They have friends who made major life changes after conversations the Sigma INFJ barely remembers, colleagues whose work was reshaped by casual observations the Sigma INFJ offered without agenda. This unconscious influence feels more genuine than strategic leadership because it emerges from overflow rather than intention, from the natural consequence of being integrated rather than from the desire to shape others. Yet this same quality makes the Sigma INFJ uncomfortable with traditional leadership roles because those roles require performance and visibility that feel inauthentic to them, involving managing people, playing politics, and tracking metrics, activities that drain rather than energize them. They lead best through example rather than authority, through demonstrating possibilities rather than directing actions, and they are happiest when others take what they need from that example without requiring the Sigma INFJ to manage or maintain any formal relationship. The eighth sign reveals itself in their comfort with paradox and complexity. The human mind naturally seeks resolution, craves clear answers and definitive categories that make the world feel stable and comprehensible. Most people, faced with contradictions, feel compelled to resolve them, to choose one side or the other, to establish certainty even if that certainty requires ignoring inconvenient evidence. The Sigma INFJ has developed an unusual capacity to hold contradictions without needing to resolve them, to sit in uncertainty without rushing to premature conclusions, to acknowledge that multiple seemingly incompatible things can be true simultaneously. This capacity reflects what the poet Keats called negative capability, the ability to remain in uncertainties, mysteries, and doubts without irritable reaching after fact and reason, and it gives the Sigma INFJ a flexibility of mind that can be both strength and vulnerability. They can understand political positions they disagree with, can perceive how someone could hold beliefs they find abhorrent without needing to demonize that person, and can acknowledge the validity of arguments that contradict their own. This does not mean they lack convictions or principles, rather, they hold their convictions with awareness that they are perspectives rather than absolute truths, that reality exceeds any single framework for understanding it. They might simultaneously believe that people should take responsibility for their lives and that systemic injustice shapes outcomes, that free will exists and that behavior is primarily determined, that meaning is constructed and that some truths are universal. These apparent contradictions do not trouble them because they recognize that reality operates at multiple levels simultaneously, that what appears contradictory from one angle reveals itself as complementary from another. This comfort with complexity makes them valuable in situations that require nuanced thinking, as they can see solutions that others miss because they are not trapped in either or thinking. However, it also alienates them from a world that increasingly demands simple tribal allegiances and clear enemy identification. They find themselves politically homeless, unable to align fully with any ideology because they see the limitations and insights of multiple perspectives, finding value in progressive and conservative thought, in spiritual and materialist worldviews, in individual and collective orientations. This intellectual homelessness mirrors their social homelessness, another way they exist between categories, another source of their outsider status, but also another source of their depth and their ability to synthesize insights from seemingly incompatible domains. The ninth sign manifests in what might be called their tragic optimism. The philosopher Camus wrote about the absurd hero Sisyphus, condemned to roll a boulder up a mountain eternally only to watch it roll back down, and suggested that we must imagine Sisyphus happy, finding meaning not despite the futility but through the act itself, through the choice to continue. The Sigma INFJ embodies this existential stance, clear-eyed about the genuine difficulties, injustices, and suffering that characterize human existence yet committed to creating meaning and beauty anyway, not from naivety but from something more like defiant grace. They have looked honestly at the darkness, both in the world and in themselves, have acknowledged the reality of death and loss and failure and the ultimate impossibility of perfect understanding or lasting security, and they have chosen to build meaning in the face of that acknowledgement rather than retreating into either bitter cynicism or false positivity. This is not optimism in the conventional sense of believing things will turn out well. It is something more complex and more valuable. The conviction that meaning, beauty, and connection remain possible and worthwhile even when things do not turn out well, even when the boulder rolls back down. They create art knowing it will not last, build relationships knowing they will end, and pursue understanding knowing it will remain incomplete. They do these things with full engagement rather than withholding or hedging, because they have accepted that impermanence does not negate value. This tragic optimism makes them simultaneously the most realistic and most hopeful people in most rooms, able to acknowledge difficulty without despair, able to maintain commitment without requiring a guarantee. When others around them collapse into nihilism or escape into fantasy, the Sigma INFJ holds the middle path, acknowledging that life is genuinely hard and genuinely worth living, that suffering is real and so is beauty, and that we are, in fact, cosmically insignificant. Yet, our choices and connections matter immeasurably on the human scale where we actually exist. This stance requires enormous internal strength because it refuses the comfort of either pole, refuses the bitterness that would justify disconnection, and refuses the delusion that would avoid reality, instead maintaining presence in the difficult middle space where full humanity actually occurs. They are the friends who can sit with you in grief without trying to fix it or minimize it, while also somehow conveying that you will survive this, that life will offer other moments worth experiencing. They are the colleagues who can acknowledge that a project has failed or a system is unjust, while still finding ways to do meaningful work within the constraints. They are the partners who can recognize relationship difficulties without abandoning ship, who can work through hard things without pretending the hard things are not hard. The 10th sign appears in their selective intimacy. The typical INFJ is often described as warm and empathetic, able to connect with almost anyone, and this remains true for the Sigma INFJ in superficial contexts. They can make anyone feel heard and understood in brief encounters, but when it comes to genuine intimacy, they are remarkably selective, allowing very few people into their inner world. This selectivity does not stem from social anxiety or fear of vulnerability, but from a clear understanding of how much energy genuine intimacy requires and how rarely they encounter people capable of meeting them at the depth they naturally inhabit. They might have hundreds of friendly acquaintances, but only 2 or 3 people who truly know them, who have access to their private thoughts and feelings, and who understand the full scope of their inner complexity. These chosen few are guarded fiercely, loved with an intensity and loyalty that can feel almost archaic in its depth, more akin to the bonds between warriors or mystics than modern friendships. The Sigma INFJ will travel across countries for these people, will show up in crisis without hesitation, will offer the kind of unwavering support that most people only promise but few deliver, because once they have granted someone access to their inner circle, that person becomes sacred in a way that transcends casual social bonds. Yet the path to this inner circle is narrow and unmarked, requires no specific credentials or shared interests, but rather some ineffable quality of authenticity and depth that the Sigma INFJ recognizes instinctively. They might meet someone once and sense immediately that this person could become truly close, or they might know someone for years and maintain friendly distance, the difference depending not on circumstances but on some subtle resonance that either exists or does not. This creates occasional misunderstanding because people often assume the Sigma INFJ's warmth and perceptiveness in casual interactions indicate a closer relationship than actually exists, and might be confused or hurt when they realize they do not actually have access to the Sigma INFJ's inner life, despite many pleasant conversations. The Sigma INFJ rarely explains this distinction because they are not trying to exclude people. They operate with clear internal boundaries that protect the solitude and selectivity necessary for their well-being, and they have long since stopped apologizing for needs that others find difficult to understand. In their actual intimate relationships, they offer a quality of presence and understanding that many people never experience elsewhere. They bring their full attention and insight to bear on the people they love, remembering small details, perceiving unspoken needs, and creating space for others to be fully themselves without judgment or agenda. These relationships, few though they may be, provide the human connection that prevents their solitude from becoming isolation, and create the bonds that make their outsider status a choice rather than a wound. So here we arrive at the question that matters, not whether you recognize these signs in yourself or others, though recognition has its own value, but what this recognition asks of you. The Sigma INFJ archetype, if we can call it that, represents not a destination but a continuously unfolding process, not a fixed identity to claim but a way of being to refine. It asks whether you will honor the depth you carry even when the world rewards surface, whether you will choose meaningful solitude over convenient belonging, and whether you will maintain your internal sovereignty even when conformity offers easier passage. It asks whether you can hold your vision clearly without becoming bitter about what you see, whether you can offer your gifts without needing recognition or reward, and whether you can build meaning in a universe that offers no guarantee that meaning exists beyond what we create. The philosopher Nietzsche, who understood outsiders because he was one, spoke of those who must become who they are, suggesting that authentic existence requires not discovering a pre-existing self but actively creating self through choices and commitments that align with one's deepest values rather than external pressures. The Sigma INFJ is engaged in this project, whether they name it as such or not, continually choosing themselves over and over in small and large ways, refined by solitude, suffering, and the difficult work of integration. This path offers no external rewards, no status markers, or social validation that might justify the difficulty. Yet, those who walk it find they cannot walk any other path, not because they are special, but because they have done the work that makes other paths feel false. They have tasted authenticity and cannot return to performance, have experienced genuine solitude and cannot settle for mere loneliness in crowds, have built internal authority and cannot subordinate it to external hierarchies. Will you trust your own perception even when it isolates you? Will you guard your solitude even when others call it selfishness? Will you maintain your complexity even when simplicity would make you more legible and therefore more accepted? These are not rhetorical questions but genuine choices that recur throughout a life, moments where the easy path diverges from the authentic path and you must decide, again, who you will be. The Sigma INFJ makes these choices repeatedly, often invisibly, building through accumulated decisions a life that, from the outside, appears to have happened, but from the inside reveals itself as deliberately crafted, as consciously chosen, and as continuously refined. This is the quiet strength the archetype embodies, not the strength of domination or performance, but the strength of self-knowledge and self-possession. This strength needs no audience because it was forged in private and remains privately held, even when publicly visible. It is the strength of the lone wolf on the ridge, belonging to itself rather than to the pack, powerful precisely because that power requires no demonstration.